Welcome to part 2 of the overview of the history of the Wye Valley Railway. My name is Kev Daniels. I'm a volunteer for the Wye Valley Greenway, which reopened part of the Wye Valley Railway as a walking and cycling route between Chepstow and Tidenham in 2021. A full introduction is available at the video titled History of the Wye Valley Railway Introduction. Our opening slide shows Tidenham Tunnel, which will be covered in this presentation. We start by talking about the engineers on the line. The engineers designed and supervised the construction of the railway. On the left is Samuel Hansard Yockney, and he worked under Brunel and he impressed him. He was the great-great-grandfather of Ian Langston Yockney. And the challenge was how to trace a descendant of Samuel, and furthermore, whether these descendants hold family records. Now, I found that going back in time is not that difficult because you can start with a name of somebody alive today. From that, you can find their birth certificate. From that, you can find their parents, and so on. But going forward, you have to start almost certainly at the last census. How do you know who the children were? Which is a difficult question, but much more difficult is where do they live? It was a challenge, and after several dead ends, I then received a phone call. It said, "My name is Ian Langston Yockney. I am a descendant of Samuel Hansard Yockney, and I hold the family records." So that was a great relief. And indeed, Ian Langston Yockney did provide us family records. But before we look at those, here is Sidney. Sidney is the son of Samuel. He was the resident engineer on the line, and he was born in 1841. He worked under Brereton, who took over Brunel's work on his death. Here is a silver key. Now this key, which the information for which has been provided by Ian Yockney, was used by a titled lady whose identity we are yet to discover. She used it to open the swing bridge on the Rhondda and Swansea Bay Railway, which was engineered by the Yockney firm. And Ian's father, Reginald, wrote, "The key was given to Florence Yockney." Florence is the wife of Sidney, or was. And the title lady was quoted as saying, "I feel that you should have this in view of your husband's very brave act." And Sidney had dived fully clothed into the tidal River Neath in an abortive attempt to save a workman who had fallen from the bridge. And on the next slide, we can see the bridge on the left-hand side, the Neath Bridge. It's a swing bridge. It pivots on that circular structure in the centre. It's locked in position to today, but it's still in use. It's a Grade 2 listed bridge. And you can see on the right, Algernon. He was the son of Sidney. He worked on that swing bridge as an engineer. Continue a little more about the engineers. And we see in this slide on the left is the application by Samuel to become an associate member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I'm grateful to the librarian at the Institution of Civil Engineers who unearthed this application by going through the bound volumes held by the institution. And she told me that she thought that the proposer here was actually Brunel. And in order to demonstrate that, here we are. This is a lithograph, and this is an authentic signature of Brunel, and you can see that they are the same signatures. Later on, Sidney applied to become an associate member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. He was also proposed by Brereton, but in red across the application is written declined his election. Not quite sure why, although he had quite a lot less experience as Samuel had had when he made his application. It didn't seem to affect Sidney's career, and 9 years later he was admitted as a full member, again with his application being signed by Brereton. Now I'm going to show you where the Yockneys lived while the railway was being constructed. They had bought a property called Y Cottage, and that's on the Lankout Peninsula near Tidenham. And it was owned by the Yockneys for nearly 70 years. And it wasn't even a mile from this point here, which is the Tidenham Tunnel, the major construction site on the line. Samuel died in the house in 1893, and then in the 1939 electoral roll, there were 5 Yockneys of voting age living there. And it was quite a large house because there were 13 rooms recorded in the 1911 census. Now I'm going to turn to look at an engraving at the tunnel when the tunnel was open. This was an engraving in the Illustrated London News, contemporary with opening in the tunnel, and you will see at this point here there was a short tunnel, then a gap, then the beginnings of the main tunnel. Now today there is no gap between the short tunnel and the main tunnel, and I'm indebted to Graham Bickerdike to actually point out to me that if you stepped 70 metres inside the existing tunnel and looked up, you would see this keystone. This keystone is actually at that point, which is the beginning of the second tunnel when it was originally constructed. So the tunnel between the location between here, the short tunnel, and the main tunnel was arched over at some time in the past. And if you look at this land registry map here, you will see land registry for Dell House, that there is a blue area encircled by dotted lines, and that means in that blue area the subsoil beneath a depth of 3 feet is excluded from the title plan. So the house owners who lived here have no rights over the tunnel or the railway, and that covers exactly the area which was between the 2 tunnels. But now, to be sure, how do we know when the overarching took place? Well, to know that, or at least to get an approximate date, we can look at 2 Ordnance Survey maps. This is an Ordnance Survey map from 1900, and at this point you see the symbol of a railway. It's a solid line with horizontal short lines, and you'll notice it passes under the short tunnel and then carries on in the open as a railway, and at this point it goes into a symbol for a tunnel with just dotted lines and no line showing. In contrast, in 1919 the railway line comes along, goes under the short tunnel and continues in a tunnel. So we do know that this arching over took place between 1900 and 1919. I'm now going to talk about the tunnel itself. It was approximately 1,000 metres long, and it had lined sections, these are the brickwork of lining, and unlined sections. So this is the hard limestone that the tunnel was built through. Now the reason for arching the tunnel was that when it was inspected by the Inspector of Railways, Colonel Rich, he demanded, before he would accept that the railway could run, that a number of parts of the tunnel were arched over. So several, and maybe all, of the arched over areas took place before the tunnel went into use as a railway. Now you'll see here also there is a fault line which must have given a bit of concern to the actual builders of the railway. And you can't tell where the various entrances to the railway tunnel, when it was being built, join up. It looks to be a perfect join. The tunnel would have been built from both ends, and also a shaft was dropped in the middle somewhere, and at that point the tunnel would have been also built by excavating from both ends of the bottom of the shaft. So the tunnel has got to meet up in two locations, and it seemed to. But we can be more certain about the accuracy if we think about the Rhondda Tunnel, which was also built by Sidney Yockney. It was 3 times as long, and it was finished in 1890. And it was celebrated for the fact that the join between the tunnel borings was accurate within half an inch. But to give an idea of the anxiety caused when attempting to align tunnel sections, in 1893 in Sicily, a spiral tunnel, rather like the coils of a spring, was planned between Modica and Ragusa. The radius of the tunnel was 300 metres. The purpose of this was to enter a hillside at one point and come at a point somewhat higher. The engineer was so concerned about the accuracy of the tunnel alignment that he committed suicide the day before the tunnel was complete. Sadly, though, in fact, it was perfectly aligned, leaving the rock face at the intended location. In order to build the tunnel, we know from the sale of surplus plant and material notice after the tunnel was constructed that Ingersoll rock drills were used. These were invented in the United States only a few years earlier. Those rock drills, which are like pneumatic drills today, well, they are just the same really. And we know that they were used because in this notice it said, we include a tunnel boring machine by Ingersoll, including a horizontal 10 horsepower engine and about 500 yards of 2¼ inch wrought iron air tubing. So it could work from any location in the tunnel at the work face which the navvies were working at. When the holes were drilled by the Ingersoll rock drill, they were packed with explosive and then blasting took place. But the blasted rock had to be removed by hand, and to start with it wouldn't have ordinarily fallen down in neat pebble-sized pieces. The large lumps of rock probably had to be broken down before they could be loaded into wagons. That was done manually, as there were no mechanical means available to do that. The tunnel work was double shifted, but it took 20 months to complete, and the progress was 2 yards a day, which was considered a good achievement at the time. Now on the left-hand side, sadly, we have an accident report in a local paper about Peter Pidsley, who was instantly killed by a falling piece of large rock. He left a widow Ellen and a son James, age 1. Now Peter was an agricultural labourer at Salton in Devon near Exeter, as was his father before him. Peter, like others, came because of the higher wages. A further accident occurred where there was an explosion and a navvy was badly burnt. This was almost at the same spot where Peter Pidsley was killed 4 months before. And the navvy on this occasion was, by sad coincidence, the brother of Peter Pidsley. And it is unfortunate to have to say that there were other accidents as well. This brings to the end part 2.